Okay, we started the last time our discussion in chapter number 8 with the variance analysis of variable manufacturing overhead and the fixed manufacturing overhead, which is the manufacturing overhead part of the costs. Of course, we started with the variable manufacturing overhead, and as we can see from our level 2 analysis that was done in chapter number 7 or in previous lectures, that we have an actual variable manufacturing overhead by the amount of $130,500 and a flexible budget amount of $120,000. Therefore, as we can all see, that there is a difference between the flexible budget amount and the actual result by the amount of $10,500 unfavorable. We said that the $130,500 and the $120,000, of course, were computed as follows. We first computed the $120,000 according to our standard by the amount of 0.4 hours, of course, per unit, multiplied by 10,000 units, multiplied by, I think, $30, which was the standard rate. Therefore, this is the standard quantity for actual output multiplied by the standard rate. Correct? And the $130,500, of course, were also according to the same calculation, but according to actual numbers, not standard numbers. As we can see here, we took the standard quantity multiplied by the standard rate, but here we are going to consider the actual quantity and the actual rate. Therefore, here it was 4,500 machine hours, which is 0.45 hour per unit multiplied by the 10,000. Of course, multiplied by $29. Therefore, which is the actual quantity, of course, for the actual output. Because of the, if we said actual quantity, it will be for the actual output, multiplied by the actual rate. Of course, we started our analysis of this variance by considering an efficiency variance, which is the difference between this amount and this amount. As we can see here, according to our standard, we should have used only 4,000 machine hours, according to our standard. But according to our actual result, we have used 4,500 machine hours. Therefore, this is the first variance, which is an efficiency variance by the amount of course, 500 machine hours. It is not an amount, but the number of units that is different between the actual and the standard machine hours. 500 machine hours. Of course, which costs $30 per machine hour. This would be the amount of this variance. Therefore, as we can see, this is the first variance, which is the difference between these two. And of course, according to our discussion the last time, we said that we might have different causes that might explain this variance. We said that, for instance, we might have less efficient workers or less skilled workers. Therefore, they needed more time on the machines in order to produce the same number of jackets. Because as we can see here, we are talking about the same number of units, the 10,000 actual output. Here, the standard or the expectation was to use only 0.4 machine hour, but the actual was 0.45. Therefore, they used up more machine hours than expected. Therefore, the first cause could be because of the use of less skilled workers. This is one of the reasons, or could be one of the reasons. What else? What do we have as another reasons?
Direct material. We use direct material actual.
Excellent. We said, according to our analysis, that we might have a problem in our quality of the direct materials. Therefore, poorer qualities or less than the standard quality of the direct materials could cause us or cause the workers to work more time on the machines in order to produce the same number of units. Therefore, it might be because of the poorer quality of the direct materials. What else? Excellent. We might have a problem in setting the standard itself. We said that each unit needs 0.4 machine hours. Maybe our expectation, or maybe our, let us say, the standard itself or the building of the standard itself had some problems. Maybe the actual amount was a more realistic amount than the 0.4. It could be. What else? We might have problems in excellent in the maintenance itself. Maybe the machines are not well maintained as they should be. Therefore, if they are not well maintained, therefore they maybe use up more hours to produce one jacket because they have some issues or some problems or mechanic problems and so on. Therefore, as we can see here, we have a lot of reasons. Therefore, the management, after knowing this efficiency variance for the variable manufacturing overhead, they need to assume or they need to analyze what is the main reason, what is the cause of this actual efficiency variance. They need to determine the actual reason, the actual cause, in order to make corrective actions. They need to make corrective actions after this variance or after the knowledge of this variance. Any questions? Of course, this what we took in the last lecture. Now let us consider what is the second cause. Yes, what would be the second cause? As we can see here, the first cause of the variable manufacturing overhead variances could be first because of the difference between the standard quantity for the actual output or the standard quantity of the allocation base and the actual quantity of the allocation base, which is in this case the machine hours. So what would be the second cause for the variable manufacturing overhead? Excellent. Excellent. Therefore, the second cause would be the difference between the standard rate, which is the $30, and the actual rate, which is the $29. Therefore, this difference between the standard rate and the actual rate would be called a spending variance, of course, by the amount of $1. So as we can see here, that we have different rates or different standard rate than the actual rate. How did we calculate this rate? What was the method of calculation of this rate? The $30 and the $29. How do we calculate the rate or the cost of the machine hour or the cost of the allocation base or 1 unit of the allocation base? How do we calculate the manufacturing overhead rate? which is the allocation rate. Excellent. Therefore, this rate, whether the standard or the actual, was calculated by the following equation: the cost pool divided by the number of units of the allocation base. Of course, for the actual rate, we use the actual cost pool and the actual number of units of the allocation base. And of course, for the flexible budget or for the standard rate, we use the standard cost pool divided by the standard number of units of the allocation base. But nevertheless, this is the way, or this is the method to calculate the rate, whether it is the standard or the actual. Now, who can tell me what would be the difference, or what might be the cause of this $1 difference or spending difference? Some of you would say that it might, or we would have a $1 difference, or a difference between the standard rate and the actual rate, because of two things: the change in the cost pool itself, or the change in the number of units of the allocation base, which we considered in our efficiency variance. Correct? The efficiency variance is concerned or focuses upon the difference between the actual and the budgeted machine hours. Correct? Therefore, we considered the number of units of the allocation base, or the difference between the number of units of the allocation base between, of course, the actual and the budgeted or the standard. Correct? So, some of you would say, or might say, that this difference was because of this difference. Correct? It is somewhat a realistic thing to say. Correct? That the difference in the number of units of the allocation base would most definitely change our rate. Therefore, maybe the change between the number of units of the allocation base according to our standard and the actual has an effect on the change between the standard rate and the actual rate. So, how can we say, or how can we be sure that the difference between the standard rate and the actual rate was not because only of the difference between the standard and actual machine hours, and also the change in the cost pool itself? Let us go back to the numbers. Let us go back to the numbers. As we can see here, our increase in the machine hours was by the number of 500 machine hours, correct? Which is a 12.5% increase. Correct? Therefore, it would be realistic to say that if we had an increase by 500 machine hours, or we had an increase by 12.5% in machine hours, the variable manufacturing overhead expenses would also increase by 12.5%, or by an amount in dollars, which is 12.5%. Therefore, was this the case? Let us see. We had 130,500, which is the actual, while as the expected was 120,000, which is a difference, by the amount of $10,500, which is approximately 8.75% increase. Therefore, the increase in machine hours did not only or was not the only cause to the change in the costs. Because if the machine hours was the only cause of increasing or changing the variable manufacturing overhead, we would see that the change would be also 12.5%. Therefore, according to these numbers, according to this analysis, we can say that the machine hours or the change in the machine hours was not only the cause in the change in the variable manufacturing overhead costs. Therefore, we could say that we also might have a variance which is because of the difference between the actual and the standard cost pool itself. What if the increase in the machine hours or the increase in the variable manufacturing overhead was the same? If, for instance, we had a change in the manufacturing overhead or variable manufacturing overhead which equals the change or the percentage change in the machine hours itself. This would mean that the machine hours or the change in the machine hours was only the cause or was the only cause for the change in the variable manufacturing overhead. But as we can see here, this is not the case. We have two percentages that are different. We had an increase in machine hours by 12.5%, and according to our understanding for variable costs, we would have or we would expect the same change or percentage change in the variable manufacturing overhead, which is the definition of variable expenses. What is the definition of variable expenses? Who can remind us by the definition of the variable manufacturing overhead or variable expenses?
I think that more expenses that we will pay, that means more cost, more service. That change.
Therefore, as the number of units increases, as the number of units of the allocation base or the cost driver increases, there would be an increase or proportionate increase in the costs. This is a variable cost, of course within a relevant range and of course within a specific time period, and of course in total. But as we can see here from our definition, we would expect to have an increase in variable manufacturing overhead by 12.5% because this is a variable manufacturing overhead expense. Therefore, if the machine hours or the cost driver increased by 12.5%, we should expect that the variable manufacturing overhead would also increase by 12.5%, which was not the case. Therefore, we had another influence. We had another cause that caused or that was the reason to have the change between the $130,500 and the $120,000. Therefore, this would be the spending variance. Therefore, if in our exam we give you a question, explain what do we mean by a spending variance, and for instance, if the change or the percentage change in the and let us say if we had a question as follows: explain the spending variance and explain what are the causes of the spending variance. Therefore, you need first of all to state that some would understand the spending variance as the change, or it might cause, or it might be because of the change in the number of units of the allocation base. Of course, this might be correct if the percentages are identical. But if the percentages are not identical, therefore, it is not only because of the change in the number of units of the allocation base, but also we have a variance. We have a difference between the standard cost pool and the actual cost pool. Therefore, this cost pool consists of what? In order now to understand what we mean by a spending variance now. We said that the spending variance is not, or do not consider it as only because of the change in the number of units of the allocation base. Do not consider it as the reason the variance is because of the change between the actual and the standard quantity of the machine hours, which was considered in our efficiency variance. Now, the cost pool here, which was used in order to calculate the rate, consists of what? Of course, the variable expenses. But this is a cost pool, which means that we have different items of variable manufacturing overhead costs. For instance, this cost pool could consist of the following. Could consist of, let us say, indirect materials. Could consist of indirect labor. Could consist, for instance, of electricity, and so on. Therefore, as we can see here, we are not talking about only one item of costs, but we are talking about different items of costs. So how did we calculate the cost pool? By knowing the quantity of each item and multiplied it by the price of this item. And this goes for all of these items. Correct? Therefore, if I would ask you now, what are the reasons of having a spending variance? Of course, we said that the spending variance would occur if we have a standard rate that is different than the actual rate. And of course, it is not attributable to the change in the number of units of the allocation base, because as we showed according to our analysis, that the change in the machine hours was not only the cause in the change in the variable manufacturing overhead cost. Therefore, we have another reason, which is the spending variance reason, which is, let us say, attributable to the cost pool itself. Therefore, if I'm asking now, what are the different reasons, or what are the different causes of a spending variance? So what do you think might be the causes or reasons of a spending variance? What do you think? Yes? The cost pool. Yes? We are considering now the flexible budget variance, and we are detailing this variance. We are starting with the 10,500, and we need to detail this variance. We detailed, or we analyzed this variance into an efficiency variance and a spending variance. Now we are considering what are the different causes of a spending variance. First of all, we might have prices. Of course, according to our variance, this variance would be a favorable one, correct? Because we had a standard rate which is less than the actual rate. Therefore, we would have a spending variance which is favorable. The actual is less than the standard rate, the $30, which is the standard rate is more than the actual rate of the amount of $29. Therefore, we would have a favorable variance here, a favorable spending variance. Therefore, cause number one could be is that the prices of the different items within the cost pool, within the variable manufacturing overhead cost pool, could be lower than expected. For instance, we expected that the kilowatt of electricity would be $0.1. The actual cost was 0.09. It was not 0.01, it was 0.09. Therefore, as we can see here, the actual price was less than the expected price. For instance, the price of the indirect labor, we considered, or the rate of the indirect labor, we considered or expected the direct manufacturing labor hour to cost $30. It costed, for instance, 20, or let us say we expected to have a cost of $30 as a direct manufacturing labor hour, or as a cost for the direct manufacturing labor hour, but it was less than the $30, maybe $29.5 or $29. For instance, the indirect materials, we considered or we expected the price of 1 kilogram of the indirect materials to be $10, but the actual price was $9 or $8. Therefore, as we can see here, the first reason to have a favorable spending variance is to have lower costs than expected within the cost pool itself. Therefore, the prices of the individual items, one or all of the individual items within the cost pool, could be less than expected. Of course, if it is unfavorable, it would be quite the opposite. That means that the actual would be more than what was expected or the standard prices. Correct? Therefore, this is the first reason for our spending variance. What is the second reason? What do you think is the second reason? Yes? This is the same. We said that the spending variance is because of the different, or the difference in the prices between the actual and the expected prices. Of course, this is one of the explanations of this reason. That, for instance, we negotiated successfully, let us say, or in a more efficient manner. We switched suppliers and so on. All the same explanations that we took according to our direct materials analysis. The same thing. But now, what would be another cause of the cost pool, or the changes in the or the difference between the standard rate and the actual rate? That is because of the cost pool itself. The standard and actual quantity, excellent. But here, according to the quantity, we need to say, because as we said, that the quantity of these different items is related to the quantity of the allocation base, correct? Because according to our expected allocation base, according to our determination of the allocation base, we said that each machine hour would use up, for instance, 10 kilowatts of, or 1 kilowatt of electricity. Therefore, one machine hour would use up 1 kilowatt of electricity, which costs, for instance, $0.1. Therefore, we are considering the cost pool according to the 1 kilowatt multiplied by the 0.1. That means that each machine hour would cost us $0.1 in electricity costs, or electricity usage costs. This is the meaning of our cost of one machine hour, or the rate of allocating the variable manufacturing overhead. Therefore, we need to now consider that the quantity of the usage of the variable manufacturing overhead item was not changed as, or the percentage change in the quantity of the variable manufacturing overhead item was not as the percentage change in the number of units of the allocation base. Because as we can see here, according to our rate, we are saying that each machine hour would use up 1 kilowatt of electricity, correct? This is according to our assumption, according to our standard. Therefore, we might have the reason to say that 1 machine hour did not use 1 kilowatt of electricity. It used less kilowatts of electricity. Correct? This could be a reason or not. What do you think? This could be a viable reason, or it is not a reason at all. So, yes, it is concerned with the quantity, but we need to take into consideration that this is a variable manufacturing overhead, which means that the change in the number of units of the allocation base would most definitely change the quantity in these items of the variable manufacturing overhead. But we might consider an assumption or a reason that the change in the quantity of these items within the variable manufacturing overhead cost pool was not as the same change in the number of units of the allocation base. Of course, here we are considering a favorable variance. Therefore, for instance, the change in the number of units of the allocation base, the increase in the number of units of the allocation base was not met by the same percentage increase in the kilowatts. Therefore, we would have a favorable spending variance, correct? مش احنا حكينا هلا الآن بدنا نحكي بالعربي هينا أنا شايفكم. فبالتالي الآن حكينا السبندنج فاريانس هي متعلقة بإيش؟ بحاجتين. يعني في بعض منا ممكن يجي يحكي إنه والله السبندنج فاريانس أنا أصلا موجود عندي، لأنه أنا في النهاية حسبت الدولار هذا بناء على إيش؟ بناء على الفرق ما بين الستاندرد ريت وما بين الأكتشوال ريت، وإحنا عارفين إنه الريت بينحسب بناء على حاجتين كمان، بناء على الكوست بول وبناء على النمبر اوف يونتس اوف ذا الوكيشن بيس. تمام هيك؟ فبالتالي الان بكل بساطه ممكن اي واحد يجي يحكي لي الاختلاف هان اللي هو الاختلاف الدولار هان هو بسبب يا اما الكوست بول يا اما ايش؟ النمبر اوف يونتس اوف ذا الوكيشن بيس، صح؟ يعني رجعنا برضه انه السبب هان لايش؟ لسببين، لا انا بدي احاول اخليه ايش؟ لسبب واحد. فبالتالي ممكن اي واحد يجي يحكي لي انه والله هل هو فعلا الدولار هذا كان فقط بسبب النمبر اوف يونتس ولا بسبب الاثنين ولا بسبب واحد فيهم؟ زي ما احنا شفنا اول حاجه في الافشنسي فارينس كان في عندي اختلاف في الماشين اورز، صح؟ فبالتالي بلا شك انا عارف انه كان في عندي اختلاف في النمبر اوف يونتس اوف ذا الوكيشن بيس، لانه بناء على الستاندرد ريت اخذت الستاندرد نمبر اوف يونتس اوف ذا الوكيشن بيس اللي هي ال 4000، ولكن بالنسبه للاكتشوال ريت انا اخذت ايش؟ اللي هو الاكتشوال نمبر اوف يونتس اوف ذا الوكيشن بيس اللي هي ال 4500. فبالتالي بلا شك ال1 دولار فرق هذه هي احد اسبابها اللي هو الاختلاف ما بين ال 4000 وال 4500. تمام؟ لكن انا الان بدي اجي ابين سبب اخر غير الاختلاف ما بين ال 4000 وال 4500. تمام هيك؟ فبالتالي اجينا حكينا واجينا فرجينا انه انا فعلا في عندي اثر ثاني في الاختلاف ما بين ال 130500 و 120000، لانه هذه عباره عن تكاليف ايش مالها؟ تكاليف متغيره، صح ولا لا؟ فبالتالي بناء على مفهومنا للتكاليف المتغيره لازم يكون عندي الاختلاف او نسبه الاختلاف في التكلفه مساويه لنسبه الاختلاف وين؟ في عدد الوحدات بالنسبه لايش؟ للالوكيشن بيس، بالنسبه لعدد وحدات المنتجه مثلا. فبالتالي هل الكلام هذا كان صحيح؟ أنا زادت عندي الماشين hours by 500 machine hours by a percentage of 12.5%، لكن هل أنا فعلا كان في عندي زيادة في التكلفة ب 12.5%؟ لا، كانت 8.75%. يعني كان عندي أنا زيادة ب 12.5% عدد وحدات اللي هو النمبر اوف يونتس اوف ذا الوكيشن بيس اللي هي الماشين اورز او عدد ساعات عمل الآلات، ولكن هل كان هناك مقابلها زيادة ب 12.5% في التكلفة؟ من المفترض انه يكون فعلا، لانه هذا هو مفهوم الفاريبل اكسبنسز. فبالتالي من الكلام هذا، من عدم التطابق هذا، باجي بعرف انه انا هناك ايش؟ اثر اخر، سبب اخر على التغير من اللي هو ال 130500 و 120000. وكذلك انا بعرف انه favorable variance حتى. لانه مش انا المفروض يكون في عندي الزياده هان ب 12.5 لكن كانت اقل من 12.5. ايش معناتها؟ معناته انه راح يكون في عندي favorable spending variance على طول مباشره. تمام هيك؟ الان ما دام انا عارف انه مش النمبر اوف يونتس اوف ذا الوكيشن بيس هي السبب الوحيد، يعني انا في عندي سبب ايش؟ الكوست بول. واحنا حكينا انه الكوست بول هو عباره عن عده ايتمز، عده امور او عده تكاليف مختلفه، زي ما شفنا ممكن يكون indirect materials, indirect labor, or the electricity and so on and maintenance and so on. طبعا انا كيف حسبت الكوست بول؟ هي عباره عن الكوانتيتي للايتم هذه في البرايس للايتم هذه. تمام؟ فبالتالي اول سبب حكينا انه والله ممكن يكون في عندي المشكله وين؟ في البرايس. انا والله كنت متوقع برايس مثلا $10 كان $9 بالنسبه للماتيريالز، فبالتالي بلا شك راح يكون في عندي الكوست بول ايش ماله؟ الحقيقي اقل من المتوقع، فبالتالي راح يكون في عندي اللي هو favorable spending variance. This is one of the reasons. تمام هيك؟ وهذا الكلام بيمشي مع ايش؟ مع كل الايتمز الموجودين في الفاريبل مانيفاكتشرنج اوفر هيد. لكن الان بالنسبه له اللي هو امر مهم جدا انه نفهمه، وطبعا اللي بيكون فاهم اللي هو كيفيه تخصيص التكاليف اللي احنا حكينا فيها في كوست اكاونتنج 1 وبدانا برضو كذلك في الحديث عنها وتحدثنا عنها في بدايه اللي هو الكوست اكاونتنج 2، راح يجي يفهم الموضوع هذا من غير اي مشاكل. فبالتالي ايش الاثر الثاني في الكوست بول، او ايش المسبب، او خلينا نيجي نحكي اللي بيأثر، او ما هي السبب الذي يمكن ان يؤثر على التكاليف هذه؟ بكل بساطه انا عندي، احنا حكينا انه هذه عباره عن ايش؟ تكاليف متغيره. يعني التغير في عدد الوحدات بالنسبه للنمبر اوف يونتس اوف ذا الوكيشن بيس اللي هي هان عدد ساعات عمل الالات، بلا شك راح ياثر في الكوانتيتي، صح ولا لا؟ لانه ساعه عمل غير عن 10 ساعات عمل آلات، صح؟ يعني بالنسبة للإلكتريسيتي لو أنا استخدمت ساعة عمل آلة واحدة، هل نفس الإلكتريسيتي راح تاخذ مني إذا أنا استخدمت 100 ساعة عمل آلة؟ لو أنا استخدمت 1000 ساعة عمل آلة؟ بلا شك إذا الأولى زادت الثانية راح تزيد. هذه هي الفاريبل مانيفاكتشرنج أوفر هيد، هذه هي مفهوم التكاليف المتغيرة، صح ولا لا؟ فبالتالي بكل بساطة إذا أنا كان في عندي favorable variance، إيش معنات هذا الكلام؟ معناته انه كان في عندي efficiency in the use of the different items within the variable manufacturing overhead cost pool. يعني كان في عندي كفاءة في استخدام هذه التكاليف. طبعا كيف هذه الكفاءة بتصير؟ انه بكل بساطة احنا متوقعين زي ما احنا شفنا هان انه كل ساعة عمل آلة تاخذ مني 1 كيلو وات من الكهرباء. تمام؟ هذا بناء على الكوانتيتي. لكن فعليا أنا والله بسبب مثلا خلينا نيجي نحكي الآلات والله كانوا أو عملت لهم صيانة ممتازة جدا، فبالتالي كان أو سحب الكهرباء بالنسبة للآلة هذه كان إيش؟ أقل من المتوقع، أو أنا غيرت اللي هو الديزاين أوف ذا برودكشن بروسيس، فبالتالي خلينا نيجي نحكي صرت أنا أطلع أو أستخدم عدد ساعات الآلات بطريقة تخفض اللي هو إيش؟ استهلاك الكهرباء مثلا وما إلى ذلك. فبالتالي الماشين أور ما استخدمت المتوقع من ايش؟ من الكيلو واتس، استخدمت اقل من المتوقع. فبالتالي استخدامي اقل من المتوقع، يعني اذا الكوانتيتي عندي انخفضت بناء على الزياده في ايش؟ في الماشين اورز، فبالتالي بلا شك الكوست بول ايش ماله؟ راح ينخفض، صح ولا لا؟ فبالتالي بلا شك انا راح يكون في عندي favorable spending variance. طبعا على العكس الكلام تماما، اذا كان في عندي unfavorable spending variance راح يكون العكس، انه انا في النهايه راح يكون في عندي عدم كفاءه، يعني انا استخدمت كميه اعلى من الكميه المتوقعه للوحده الواحده من ايش؟ من الالوكيشن بيس. يعني انا كنت متوقع انه كل ساعه عمل تستخدم 1 كيلو وات، لكن في النهايه او في الوضع الطبيعي او الحقيقي اللي صار عندي انه والله استخدمت 1.2 كيلو وات من الكهرباء. فبالتالي انا هان الكوانتيتي عندي زادت بناء على الزياده في ايش؟ في النمبر اوف يونتس اوف ذا الوكيشن بيس. ديروا بالكم، لانه انا في النهايه بدي افصل ما بين الحاجتين، بديش انا لا احكي السبندنج فارينس هو بسبب الافشنسي فارينس والسبندنج فارينس، لا، انا بدي اجي افصل انه والله السبندنج فارينس هو فقط بسبب مين؟ بسبب الاختلاف في الكوانتيتي بالنسبه للفاريبل ايتمز او الفاريبل مانيفاكتشرنج اوفر هيد ايتمز، او البرايسز اوف ذا فاريبل مانيفاكتشرنج اوفر هيد ايتمز، يعني متعلقه وين؟ في الكوست بول، مش النمبر اوف يونتس اوف ذا الوكيشن بيس. فبالتالي we now say that the spending variance is first of all could be because of the difference between the actual and the standard price between, or for the different items within the variable manufacturing overhead cost pool, or could be the spending variance was because of the change in the quantity of the different items within the variable manufacturing overhead was not as the same change within the number of units of the allocation base. That means that the number of units of the allocation base changed, but it did not correspond with the same change, or the quantity of the variable manufacturing overhead items did not correspond with the same change. It either changed or increased in a let us say in a less manner. Therefore, the increase was not with the same percentage. Therefore, for instance, as we saw, the increase by 10% in the number of units of the allocation base did not correspond with the same percentage. It corresponds with a lower percentage of change or increase. Because we most definitely know if the number of units of the allocation base increased, the quantity of the variable manufacturing overhead would also increase. But this increase would be in a lower manner. It would not be, or the percentage change would not be the same. Therefore, these are the two reasons that would explain the spending variance of $1. Any questions? Therefore, now, this is the analysis. Of course, this is the same analysis that we took in chapter number 7. We have 3 columns: the actual quantity multiplied by the actual rate, actual quantity multiplied by the budgeted rate. Therefore, the difference between these two is because of the difference in the rate, which is the spending variance. Therefore, as we can see here, we have a $30 budgeted rate and $29 actual rate. The difference here is $4,500 favorable. Why? Because we expected to incur $135,000, but we incurred $130,500, which is less than expected. Therefore, it is a favorable spending variance. Of course, also here, according to our flexible budget, we considered that we need to use 4,000 hours according to our standard. We produced 10,000 units. Each unit would use up 0.4 machine hours. Therefore, we would use up 4,000 machine hours in total, multiplied by the budgeted rate by the amount of $30. Of course, comparing it with the actual quantity multiplied by the budgeted rate, of course, the difference here is not because of the rate, because both are budgeted or standard rates, but the difference here would be because of the difference in the quantity of the machine hours or the allocation base. Therefore, here we use 4,500 and we expected to use only 4,000. Therefore, as we can see here, the cost would be, or what has been expected, $120,000, but the actual, according to our actual quantity, is 135. Therefore, we incurred more costs. Therefore, we would have an unfavorable efficiency variance. Therefore, the flexible budget variance is the difference between the $120,000 and the $130,500, which is the $10,500, which was, according to our level 2 analysis, within our flexible budget variances. Any questions? Therefore, now let us consider only the entries, the journal entries of these variances. Of course, according to our normal costing, we took the journal entries that would be journalized in order to recognize the different variances. Of course, according to our discussion in Cost Accounting 1, we said that we are going to allocate according to the normal costing. We are going to allocate according to a budgeted rate. And we said that most definitely we would have some differences between our allocation and the actual manufacturing overhead that would be incurred, correct? And the difference between these two would be either an under allocation or an over allocation, correct? We are going to consider the same journal entries that we took in the normal costing, because what we took in normal costing, what we call it under allocation or over allocation, is the same for us here, but it would be more detailed for a spending variance and an efficiency variance. Therefore, the same journal entries. According to our normal costing, we first of all would consider the journalizing of the actual manufacturing overhead costs, correct? Therefore, we would debit the variable manufacturing overhead control account, and we would credit, of course, various different accounts. It could be materials control, it could be wages payable, it could be salaries payable, it could be accounts payable, and so on. It could be accumulated depreciation, and so on. Therefore, this is the journal entry to recognize the actual manufacturing overhead. But are we going to allocate the actual manufacturing overhead? We said in our discussion in Cost Accounting 1, we could not wait until the end of the period in order to allocate our cost. Because, of course, if we are going to allocate the actual manufacturing overhead, we are going to wait until we receive this information, which is at the end of the period. Therefore, because we could not wait until the end of the period, we are going to use our budgeted rate. Therefore, we are going to allocate, which would be different amounts. We are going to allocate according to our budgeted amount, which is an expected amount, which we expect to be different than the actual amount or the actual cost that has been incurred. Therefore, in our allocation, we would allocate in the work in process, of course, we would debit the work in process control, and we are going to recognize another account, which is a contra account to the variable manufacturing overhead control, which is the variable manufacturing overhead allocated. And then, at the end of the period, of course, as we said, that the allocated amount would be different than the actual amount. Therefore, we might have an under allocation or an over allocation. Therefore, we need to consider, or we need to recognize this over allocation or under allocation. Therefore, the variable manufacturing overhead would be closed by debiting this amount or this account, and also the variable manufacturing overhead control, which is the actual, would also be closed by crediting this amount. Of course, the difference, if we have an under allocation, there would be an account which is debited if we have under allocation. If we have over allocation, we would credit an amount of over allocated variable manufacturing overhead. Of course, this is according to the normal costing, and we are going to make the same journal entries for the standard costing. According to our standard costing, we are going to recognize this entry according to our what? We said the standard costing would allocate the manufacturing overhead costs according to the standard quantity and the standard rate, therefore, by the amount of $120,000. Correct? This is according to our standard costing. The normal costing, it would use not the standard quantity, but the actual quantity. You need to make the difference here between the two. Therefore, we would make this amount, or we would journalize this entry by the amount of 120,000. Now, according to this, or the allocation would be according to what? Sorry. These are the actual. This would be the actual cost, not the standard cost. Therefore, the actual cost, the variable manufacturing overhead control, which is the actual cost, would be by the actual number, 130,500. And according to our standard cost, we are going to recognize what? We are going to recognize our standard quantity multiplied by the standard rate, 120,000. And of course, now we are not going to recognize the under allocation and the over allocation. According to our standard costing, we are going to recognize the spending variance and the efficiency variance. Because this is an unfavorable, it would be debited. And because this is favorable, it would be credited. We are going to continue, inshallah, the next time. Thank you for listening.